So I'm going to talk about research processes and the importance of good project planning. And I think it's probably important to say that, a lot of this looks like, oh, well, this is the stuff I'm going to do when I do the research. But actually, you have to think about all the things you're going to do when you're going to do your research before you put in your funding application, because all of these things take time and people and resources, all of which you have to budget for in your application. So I just wanted to start with a little example, I suppose, of good project planning, and that's perseverance. So is there or was there life on Mars? That was the purpose of the Perseverance rover that was sent to Mars. It was actually launched on the 30th of July 2020 from Florida. It landed on the 18th of February 2021 in the Jezero crater on Mars. And Perseverance has now been active on Mars over 4 years. So getting Perseverance from Earth to Mars in working order was an incredible piece of project management. And as an example, I just want to take you through the landing sequence. So this is when Perseverance arrived at Mars in the first place. So at the top of the Martian atmosphere at 12,500 miles per hour, the rocket basically sheds the cruise stage before entering the atmosphere, leaving the aeroshell with forward-facing heat shield, and the rover is safely inside this sort of pod. The temperature's around 2,370 degrees Fahrenheit. Shortly after entry into the atmosphere, the rover only gets up to room temperature. The thrusters are there to keep it on course. At 1,000 miles per hour, the aeroshell deploys a supersonic parachute to slow it down over 70 feet in diameter. It deploys radar and landing technology to discover its altitude and location. At 200 miles per hour, the rover separates from the back shell and the parachute, and it fires up its descent stage engines. At 1.7 miles per hour, it deploys something called the sky crane, and the rover is gently lowered onto the surface of Mars, cutting the cables with the descent stage, which crashes nearby. Now, all of this is done in 7 minutes, what NASA engineers refer to the 7 minutes of terror. And since arriving, Perseverance has found organic molecules, which may be associated with life, not yet sure. It's found evidence of water and volcanic activity on Mars. And indeed, on the 11th of March this year, it discovered some very interesting rocks, and it sent these photographs back to NASA. So a thing to give you some comfort for is at least what we don't do is rocket science. Rocket science is sort of the ultimate research project planning, but it doesn't mean that what we do is easy. Just to give you a slightly more recent example, the Intuitive Machines lunar lander, which rather sadly didn't succeed. So it landed on the 6th of March, but then it fell over, and therefore its solar panels didn't allow it to charge its batteries. And so basically the mission was over on the 7th of March. So whilst Perseverance was an incredible feat of project planning that led to success, no doubt loads and loads of project planning went into this lunar mission. And unfortunately, it fell over. Some things, go wrong and it can't be helped. So this session is all about the importance of logistics, the things you need to consider before your application, not afterwards. So as I said, many have cost and time implications that should be included in your grant application. So you won't do all of the following at the application stage, but you should consider them in planning, timetabling, and costing your study. So thinking to our 4 key propositions, it's all about success. So you're showing that this project can answer the question. It's about showing that this project is good value for money, and it's showing that the team can deliver, that they are competent to deliver. So let's think a little bit broadly about research processes. Now in NHS health research, there's a lot of context and a lot of work that's gone into building up, I suppose, the structures and environment for research within the NHS. Some of the key documents are listed here. So Good Clinical Practice, GCP, and the UK Medicines for Human Use regulations in 2004, which clearly stated the responsibilities and accountabilities for clinical trials of investigational medicinal products. This was kind of thought to be a really good document, and it was sort of adapted, I suppose, for more broad research in healthcare, and what is now the UK policy framework for health and social care research, updated in 2023, originally called the Research Governance Framework. And I have to say that of all these kind of government documents that you find out there, the Research Governance Framework and this policy framework are really practical, easy to read documents that tell you what all the different people's responsibilities are. So they are really good documents to look at. We then had Best Research for Best Health in 2006, which basically set up a lot of infrastructure and systems for health research. The NHS Constitution for England in 2015 included a commitment to promote, conduct and use research to improve health and care, and a commitment to inform patients of research studies where they could take part, and also to share anonymised data, which obviously are very important steps in making research a bit more easy to do. We then had the 5-year forward view and the NHS long-term plan, which have highlighted various NHS funding priorities. So these have informed the sorts of research that NIHR and others want to see undertaken. And saving and improving lives, the future of UK clinical research delivery in 2021 was all about how we better deliver health research. So the sorts of things you need to consider, there are a lot of hoops that you have to get through when you're undertaking research. So all research carried out in the NHS requires a sponsor and R&D or research and innovation approvals. Most research will require funding because if you're going to do research properly, it usually has to be of a certain scale to make the questions and answers possible. Most of it will require ethics approval. The HRA, Health Research Authority, have a little decision tool that you can use if you want to sort out whether your work is actually research or whether it's audit or service delivery or evaluation. Some research will require other approvals, such as clinical trial authorization, and some research will require research passports in the form of an honorary contract or letter of access. That's if you have non-clinical researchers perhaps working in a clinical environment. So if we have a little talk through these, the research support services, well, that's basically us. We're here to help you put in really good research grant applications and to perhaps, in some cases, help you find collaborations and to sort of troubleshoot any post-award issues that you may have. There are 8 of us dotted around England, and you can access any one of us. So we're not regionally based anymore like the research design services are, so you can come to whichever one you like. The Health Research Authority, most of you had heard of, so that's to do with sort of governance and ethics, a very important organisation. Lots of useful information on their website, which I've got at the end. Research and development offices, now you'll find these in most NHS trusts. There'll almost certainly be an R&D lead somewhere. And within health, higher education institutions, obviously there will be a research office who are handling all the grants and sponsorship issues. The Research Delivery Network is the former Clinical Research Network, so they've just been renamed and reformatted. So they're there to help you deliver your research. I mentioned yesterday the SOCAP form, and I'll probably mention it again today, but when you're attributing the different sorts of costs in your research, you would go to your study support service at your local RDN, and they will help you think through if you have any excess treatment costs, etc. They can also help you identify sites because they're very well networked in, and they also have research nurses who sometimes you can deploy in your research. So useful organisation to know about. Clinical trials units, there are lots of these around, and some of them are registered, most of them are registered, and basically they can help you run clinical trials and other well-designed studies. So some of them will help you organise, for example, observational studies. Some clinical trials units are quite exclusive in that they have very particular things that they're interested in and particular people that they work with. Others have a much more open door, and you can put in a request that they perhaps get involved with your research project. So if you're doing a clinical trial of an investigational medicinal product, you will almost certainly need to have a clinical trial. Well, you will need to have a clinical trials unit on board because there are so many important things that need to be attended to with those sorts of trials. But they're also available for other trials. So if you're doing a health technology assessment trial, you would probably want a clinical trials unit. If you're doing a feasibility study, you perhaps maybe don't necessarily need one, but it's good to have one in the background for the definitive trial because you probably will want to use them. And they can be tremendously helpful in offering a variety of packages. Sometimes they'll do all the sort of logistical management type things for you. Other times they might just do discrete parts of your trial, perhaps the randomization. But it obviously will depend on the clinical trial and what you're after and what support you want. Technology transfer offices are of various sizes. If you're at the University of Oxford, it's pretty big. Oxford University Innovation, we'll be hearing from Janice later today from them. But basically, they're dealing with all of your bright ideas and how to protect the intellectual property of those, and also to check that you're not snitching someone else's intellectual property by mistake. So things like freedom to operate searches they can help you with. So I have to say that not all universities have massive TTOs. Some of them have knowledge transfer offices, which tend to be a bit smaller and less well resourced. And basically, technology transfer in trusts would probably be handled by your R&D office. The MHRA, a lot of you were aware of the MHRA, a very important organisation if you are developing a new drug or repurposing a drug or medical device, a new medical device. They're very important from a regulatory point of view. Health tech research centres are the old medtech and in vitro diagnostics collaborations or collaboratives. They're basically there to help with health tech development. The Health Innovation Networks, formerly the Academic Health Sciences Networks. Gosh, I've got a good memory today. They tend to be more involved with knowledge mobilization. So if you do have a bright idea and they want to see it spread throughout the NHS, they're good people. But they can also help sometimes with, for example, I4I applications if you're after help with a commercialization strategy, for example. Then you have the local applied research collaborations who have their own little programs of local research, but they can be very useful for people to get in touch with. And perhaps NIHR's most recent thing, the Health Determinants Research Collaborations, these are based within local authorities, and it's the NIHR trying to nurture research in local authorities. So they've had various rounds of HDRCs. So research is or will be generated more in local authorities now than previously. So I've already talked about some of the things you might do. This is the sort of path you might take, and I'm sorry about all the acronyms, they're all explained there. But if you've got a bright idea, probably the first place to go is to your RSS. So chat to an RSS, write your proposal, find a sponsor, or make sure you've got a sponsor, get sites on board. Talk to your sponsor's R&D or finance office. If you've got an intervention, you need to talk about excess treatment costs. Talk to your research delivery network for cost attribution and sort of filling in and signing off the SOCAP form. And it's at that point you'd apply for research funding. And as you can see, there are various other people you might want to talk to, like clinical trials units, technology transfer offices, the study support service that the RDN have, or the MHRA, if these are relevant to your work. You then apply for your funding. If you get the funding, that's probably when you'd approach the HRA with your ethics and other approvals. Make sure you've got all those in place. You'd attend to research passports or honorary contracts. And basically, at that point, you're ready to go. Now, I'm not going to do an impersonation like Bernard, but this is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. It is perhaps the end of the beginning of your research. So you can actually now get on and do it. Project planning. Well, this is all about thinking through the people you need, the materials, equipment, and space you need, and the time you need to do the research. And it's how you organize all of this. So the who, what, when, where, and for how long of research. I think it's helpful to think about what you'll need on a day-to-day basis, sometimes just thinking through on a bit of paper, what am I going to do today to get this research off the ground? And when I'm up and running with my data collection, what am I going to do each day can be quite helpful. And I think a good thing to do is to think about maximizing benefits to all involved. And we talked a little bit about yesterday about what control groups get out of, or people who are recruited to control groups get out of research. I think it's generally realized that if people are part of a research project, they do benefit by having their care more closely monitored, etc., etc. And I think, keeping everyone on side. I had a friend who used to run a big chunk of the European prospective investigation into cancer. It was her who said, think about maximizing benefits to all involved. She used to keep everyone on board. She used to keep them updated. She used to send them Christmas cards. She used to send them little presents, all the people who are involved, keeping everyone happy, both researchers and participants. I don't expect you to read all this. This is a big study that was funded. It was known as the CRISP trial, and it was looking at coronary artery bypass grafting. And whether to use a particular sort of mode for the pump during surgery to off or on pump surgery. And it was a randomized control trial. Don't need to read it all, but I think this is very salutary. So in fact, this was a published piece of work, but in fact, they didn't, at the end of the day, have anything to publish. The trial was stopped on the grounds of futility after 106 patients, that's less than 2% of the target sample size, have been recruited in 18 months. And if we look back, we can see that urgent patients waiting for surgery in local feeder hospitals were often not transferred until late the night before surgery, which limited the time available to take consent. Several elective patients didn't want to take part because they wanted the surgeon they had met when surgery was first discussed. And despite trying to boost recruitment, they failed to do that. And so they had to give up on the trial. And of course, I don't know what went into this trial. I dare say they did do an awful lot of pre-work to try and make sure that it would work. But obviously doing a dry run of all these things, which one would hope they would have done, and maybe they did, would have shown some of these issues. And it may be that simply the feasibility study, if they did have one, didn't pick up on these things for whatever reason. But, this is a big funded study, and it just didn't recruit. So let's talk about the people you need to try and make sure all of these things can happen as planned. Well, when you put a research grant together and an award goes in, an award application goes into a funder, there are sorts of different people who are involved and different people that you want to talk about. The first is the principal investigator. And obviously, we've mentioned already that the award should fit the career stage. So if you're a principal investigator, obviously it depends on the scheme, but if it's a lot of money, they will be expecting people with a track record and the experience and expertise required to run projects. If it's a smaller scheme that's perhaps designed to nurture early career researchers, such as the research for patient benefit, you can have a PI who's an ECR, but you then might have a co-PI who is in a mentoring role. They'll be wanting to look at previous grants and publications impact, according to the sorts of PI that they're looking for the particular scheme. You will then have co-applicants. So these are the people who actually put their names on the grant and will probably have an FTE dedicated to the grant. And what you're trying to get there is to show reviewers that you have the right skill mix and that there's a sensible amount of time for these people for their involvement. So you'll find that a lot of funding panels are a bit skeptical when they see 1% FTE. They'll think that's not realistic. That person really is not going to be involved in any serious way. So they do like to see more substantial FTEs funded. Obviously, apart from the co-applicants, you also have the research teams. So these might be people who you're going to employ or have in mind for your study. Perhaps you have some postdoc researchers, or you're going to employ a research manager or a project manager, and they're yet to be identified. But basically, they will have particular skills Personally, I think if you are involved in postdocs, it would be great if you could have them as co-applicants. And I think that's really good for their career development. And you don't want to continuously exclude people who are going to have quite a significant role in the project from being a co-applicant, because it's very important for their own career development. So who else would be on the research team? Well, we have this vague term collaborators. It was quite interesting yesterday in the Q&A. We had lots of, what do these things mean? Collaborator, mentor, supervisor, and some of them have very distinct names, some and meanings. Some of them are a little looser. I think collaborators is probably a little looser. So these are the kinds of people who you might be working with. It might mean the trusts who you will be gathering your data from. So you might have a named lead in each of those trusts, and they will be collaborators. It may be, for example, if you're in a fellowship, someone you're going to have a placement with to learn more about what they do and how that might inform your work. But overall, it's about bringing the right skill mix to the research team. And yes, they may have varying degrees of involvement. If it's a substantial study, you're going to want a day-to-day project manager or a coordinator, someone who really is taking responsibility for the everyday delivery of the study. You may have research assistants and nurses who are actually out there gathering data for you. And these may be people who are employed through the grant, or you may have harnessed the services of the Research Delivery Network to help with this. But they will be consenting patients, they will be collecting data, they will be collecting and processing samples for you. And then, of course, there are patients and the public, service users. Different levels of involvement, but terribly important in the planning of the research, the design, the management and dissemination of the research, and helping you to ensure that your research is inclusive. And they can have, as I say, a varying level of involvement, but increasingly we're seeing a serious contribution of patients, quite rightly, to research that's being undertaken. Other types of people, well, administrative staff, those who, maybe, sending out invitations, etc. Other sorts of consultants. So another one of these words that's rather loosely used, but in this instance is not relating to medical grade. It's very much relating to a research role. So people perhaps you go to for specialist help and advice. They might be co-applicants, such as statisticians and health economists, or you may be dipping into their expertise and paying them a consultancy fee, a daily rate, or for a period of time on the project. And then you have other support staff, people external to the study, but whose help may be needed. So it might be staff on wards helping to identify patients, librarians identifying relevant articles, your local data protection officer, etc. And then there are groups of people you will often see involved in research. So a steering committee is very common. So a group of people who are basically independent advisors, but working with the project team to oversee the work, ensuring that the study happens as intended, keeping you with your milestones in mind. Some trials and projects will want a data safety or monitoring board or a data monitoring and ethics committee. Basically, it means roughly the same thing. This is an independent group of people, usually involving a statistician who will periodically check on the data being collected. And this is for patient safety purposes. So they'll be picking up on adverse events. If the intervention is having a massive impact early on, it may be possible to stop the trial early. If the intervention is having a negative effect, it might also be necessary to stop the trial. So that's the sort of thing that a DMEC will look out for. They will also be involved in monitoring of data quality and integrity, which is obviously terribly important for the study. You may also have advisory groups, and I don't want you to think that every single project has all of these different groups, but these are the sorts of groups that people will involve in studies, but the number and type will depend on the study that you're doing and the scale of the study that you're doing. So these other advisory groups, and we've already talked about, well, there will be patient advisory groups who are your PPI, but it may be necessary to have other stakeholder groups. I think we probably neglect some of these other stakeholders sometimes. We concentrate on staff and patients, and we don't talk about, the actual commissioners of research or the managers in hospitals who actually have to, at the end of the day, implement some of these interventions. So there may be a need to have some other stakeholders. Thinking through how you're going to organize these people is very important. So who is in charge of what? Roles should be very clearly designated. Everyone involved should be committed in terms of interest and time. And that's a slight shot over the bows of warning in terms of if you do have, oh, let's put Prof so-and-so on this because it'll look good. If Prof so-and-so really doesn't have any time, it probably will be picked up by the panel if you've given them a very low FTE. And obviously staff management is crucial, keeping everyone happy. So a funding panel needs to see how the research team will function and that the personnel are justified. Now, there will be logistical things you have to consider, obviously, that will affect funding and what you need. We talked a bit about patient and public involvement. You'll hear a lot more about that shortly, later in the day. But the Research Support Service and other bodies can help provide advice on recruiting PPI if you're stuck. Pre-application work on the research idea and the project plan is very important, and they will talk about logistics. And obviously this logistics, you know how long it takes to recruit people is an essential part of your research grant because it may take ages and you need to fund for that. And obviously the PPI work itself has to be timetabled and planned and costed sensibly throughout the project. And there is plenty of guidance on costing, which you'll hear about later. There'll be logistical issues around research inclusion. So if you're trying to get hold of a hard to reach group, there'll be a necessity for outreach, which can take time and effort, translation and interpretation services. So gone are the days of saying we're going to exclude people who don't speak English. That's just not acceptable. We do need to involve and have a representative sample of patients at the end of the day. So translation and interpretation services can be planned for and paid for. And it may be that you need some specialized promotional material, whether it's in the form of infographics or videos, to try and get people perhaps who have lower literacy levels involved in research. And you need to make sure you put into your timetable and therefore your funding application the time that it's going to take to do these things. In terms of staff, you have to think about liaison with personnel, the development of job descriptions, advertisements, interviewing, getting proper references, bearing in mind that a lot of your data collectors will be working in sensitive areas with people who are vulnerable. Logistical issues relating to sites, so liaison with management, liaison with health professionals, information about the study, what it will entail for the study site, the information being collected, etc. So study visits to go and visit your sites, study setup. It's very important that you allow time for those things. In terms of participants, this is a massive stumbling block, as we've already seen with the CRISP trial that I mentioned earlier. Systematic reviews show that the originally specified sample size is recruited in a little more than half of clinical trials, which is, if you think about the implications of that, given that sample sizes are undertaken to show that you've got enough people to demonstrate a significant difference if it's there, if you don't have the sample size, does the research actually deliver anything at the end of the day? So recruitment is a massive part of planning. I just want to ask you if Brian could pop on the chat, how might you ensure good recruitment in a study? So just pop some ideas in the chat and I'll give you a minute to do that. Got I can see a lot of great things coming in here. So we've got speak to PPI members, vouchers, incentives, good quality PPI, multimodal recruitment methods, hard cash, dedicated research nurses, multiple sites, remuneration, help with transport, talk to patient groups in advance and clinicians, embed the research team in the clinical environments. So we talked yesterday about understanding the culture of the environment, different ways to approach patients, going to clinics rather than patients coming to you, trusted community members and gatekeepers, advertising, good patient information, building on networks, look at where patients and participants are being seen, community versus hospital, good, clear study advertisements. These are all fantastic. Charities, brilliant. So these are all really good. Well done. Having enough staff. Yeah, so brilliant. Lots of really useful and sensible suggestions there. So in terms of recruiting, participants, a lot of those things that you said, so patient and public involvement, they can certainly help you reach the population that you want to reach if you've got a really good PPI group with lived experience of the condition that you're interested in. A clear recruitment plan and sampling strategy, thinking carefully through first contact and informed consent, having realistic timings, so using local data and applying eligibility criteria, looking at throughput and variation in caseload. And you can do that. And that's a very convincing thing for reviewers. If you say, well, we want to recruit X number of patients in each site, then you can say, we know we can do this because in the last 3 months, we've looked through how many patients who fit the eligibility criteria come through the system. So we know that we will have those patients. So that's always a good thing to do, a little bit of quick work beforehand to see how many eligible patients are likely to be coming through, because that's convincing for reviewers. Be inclusive, so bearing in mind minority, underserved, disadvantaged, particular socioeconomic groups. You need to describe your provision for overcoming poor literacy, language, and any other barriers. So you were talking about paying for transport, going out to the community, etc. All very sensible. And undertaking feasibility work, of course, will give you a good idea of likely recruitment rates. So what about communication, another very important part of project planning? So who should be involved in the study? Who should know about it? Formal agreements, so in relation to sponsorship, financial arrangements, data ownership, and authorship evenings. So you want to avoid those academic fisticuffs you get about who's going to be first and last author. Obviously, some of these things will happen once you've got the funding, but bear in mind that some of these things can take time. So your sort of health research authority checks your research and your ethics and governance checks, whether the MHRA needs to be involved and the processes involved with that. Local R&D offices, so discussion of treatment costs and confirmation of capacity and capability. The research delivery network for cost attribution and helping you find study sites. Your TTOs for intellectual property. A clinical trials unit, so finding one, making sure you costed for it and then they've told you how much time they'll need. Thinking through external communications, whether you're going to have a website, how you're going to handle publicity for the work. And the sorts of people who might need to know from a logistical point of view are senior managers in the health service, where perhaps you're collecting data, healthcare professionals, medical records officers, the pharmacy if you're doing a trial, clinics and ward clerks, and indeed GPs. So making sure that you're thinking through all those and the logistical implications of involving those people. So start talking to people early on. If you have people on board, the funding application is more convincing. So again, specifics are convincing. Thinking through ongoing communication. So again, this is something you will be doing, but actually thinking through the time and logistical aspects of these, so you make sure that it's all built into your grant application. You need clearly defined for roles for researchers, a kind of chain of command. You need to know that if there's a little problem on the ground, that there'll be someone that person can go to so that it can be very quickly troubleshooted. I have seen studies where there haven't been enough control over the data collection, and suddenly you've got a gap of 2 months in a site because someone hasn't turned up because they're unwell or something. So being really with massive antennae out to make sure you know that everything's rolling along as it should, and that if there are any problems, people know where to go to so that things can be troubleshot very quickly. You need ongoing communication to ensure data quality, reaching of project milestones, communication if necessary with an ethics committee, with participants, and making sure there's a contact person for everyone whenever required, and that will vary according to the study. That might just be every day or an administrative contact, or in fact it may be on call if you're giving someone a new drug, and obviously that needs to be costed for and organised. You need a complaints contact, backup information if you've got people out in the field gathering data. People come up with all sorts of bits and pieces, and there may be local information that you can give them that's completely perhaps unrelated to the research project, but if they do have issues and problems, and it's always nice if you can help them as long as it's not affecting the research that you're doing. Ongoing communication with study sites and personnel, politics and facilitation. So bearing in mind you do have to go visit sites regularly to see that everything's going well, and that if issues have arisen or there's an upset clinician, you can go and smooth feathers, and all of that takes time. And people. Clearly identified researchers on the ward, so you're not being confused with doctors who have a clinical qualification rather than a PhD. Or both indeed, but basically not a confusion of roles. General information exchange, query shooting, troubleshooting, and importantly, feedback and acknowledgement. I think a lot of people who take part in research get a bit annoyed when they say, well, I don't know what happened. Nobody ever told me. I don't think I'm going to take part in research again. So feedback and acknowledgement, having time for that is very important. Other resources you may need to consider, these sorts of things. So the obvious things like equipment, software, postage, stationery. Some of these things will be included in sort of institutional overheads, but you may want to check funders' guidance in relation to that. Importantly, things like data access. So it can take a while to, if you're using big data, making sure you've costed for that, and also costed for the time that might take to get your data set. So logistical considerations in the study design. So thinking through how your proposal can be operationalized, sample selection and monitoring of recruitment, if applicable, randomization, and arranging an intervention. So obtaining funding for it through excess treatment costs, training, fitting around care pathways. So obviously if you are implementing a new intervention, you need to train the staff to actually give it to people. So you need to allow time for that. So you need to ensure that people are responsible for this, and that there's time for these. So people and time are the things you're going to have to think about in your application. What about logistical considerations in terms of data collection and data management? Well, there are some general considerations. So in terms of measuring outcomes, you may need to find tools that you want to use, and there may be permissions and costs associated with those. If you are developing your own tools, that's all very well, but you may have to consider issues of validity and reliability. So maybe a tool has to be developed before you can even do the study. Lay and non-English speaking issues, collecting other information. So there'll be process, administrative and contextual information that you'll want to gather. So making sure that you've got a contact for all the patients who are involved. That, if there are other variables out there that might muck up your outcome of interest, that you are gathering that information if you've been unable to design it out of your study. Computing, databases, remote data collection, and the expertise that may be required to do all of those things. If you're doing a massive cohort study, you're almost certainly going to need a data manager who is very experienced and knows how to deal with big data sets, for example. Only collect what you need to answer the question, and that's a sort of ethical thing more than anything else. But you don't want to be bothering people with, oh, wouldn't it be interesting if, oh, we happen to have these people, so we'll ask them this. So be a bit careful of that. And you can always check the sorts of analyses, for example, with dummy variables for a sanity check on perhaps how long it's going to take you to do sort of data analysis. So how will the data be collected, by whom, where and when? If you're using big data, the application process and the time and indeed the money this may take. Holidays and bank holidays, if you're doing postal questionnaires, data checking and quality control. So if someone's entering data, are they doing it in a quality controlled way, perhaps double data entry? Do you need a data manager? Issues related to data governance, so data security, whether you need a data protection impact assessment, procedures for reporting adverse events, computing, the coding and data entry, and data cleaning prior to analysis. If you're collecting biological samples, how are these going to be analysed? Will it be in-house, or is there some central laboratory to whom samples are being sent? And if so, how are you going to send them? Do you need a specialist courier? Do they have to be frozen, etc.? And if you are transporting elsewhere, do you have local storage until you can do that in fridges and freezers? And is there a need for the provision of long-term storage, for example, in a biobank, and the Human Tissue Act issues there? In terms of CTIMPs, so these very particular clinical trials of investigational medicinal products, there's a whole plethora of other things that kick in. So MHRA approvals and costs, the preparation and supply of the study drug and placebo. So thinking through the supplier, the packaging, the labeling. Who is responsible for pharmacovigilance? Is it a contract research organization or a clinical trials unit? Basically get specific advice from your sponsor. Feasibility and pilot studies, now these may have taken place prior to the grant application that you're putting in, or they may be part of the grant application that you're putting in. And we talked a little bit, I think, in the Q&A yesterday about the difference between feasibility studies and pilots, and you'll find that out there in research world, people will use these terms fairly interchangeably, but the NIHR has a definition that they're happy with. So feasibility studies are all about finding out whether something can be done and should we do it, and if so, how. Whereas pilot studies, which are sort of a subset, I suppose, of these, they ask the same questions, but they tend to have design elements. They tend to be a dry run of the work that you're going to be doing to collect data, and these can be internal pilots, so basically the data will be used in the ultimate data set, or they can be external pilots if you're doing them separately, and that might depend on the extent to which you think things will change as a result of the pilot. But if you've got prior work, then it will demonstrate the viability of your work, and obviously if you are building a pilot into your study, then that has to be costed for. Logistical issues in terms of data analysis, again, this has to be planned before the study has started. So statistical, health economic, qualitative and other methods, the equipment you may need, so the hardware and software for doing the analysis. Again, time and money associated with those. Logistical issues in relation to dissemination. Some other salutary quotes. We know from follow-up of registered clinical trials that about 50% are never published in full. So at least 50% of published reports are not sufficiently clear, complete and accurate for others to interpret, use or replicate the research correctly. So put that side by side with the 50% who don't reach their sample size, and you're thinking, oh God, what a lot of research wastage. So we have to get all these things right. Otherwise, it's a waste of money and taxpayers' money at that. So you need time to make sure that you can deliver the results to the right people in the right way. It's important to demonstrate clear planning. So Gantt charts are almost always obligatory. Flow diagrams are tremendously helpful, and we talked in the Q&A yesterday about complex designs and how flow diagrams can be, gold dust to reviewers, if you're trying to interpret what people are trying to do and it's complex. Milestones. You can look at sort of published guidance for studies and trials. So things like Consort, they tell you the sorts of things that should ultimately be in your publication. It can also guide the sorts of things that you may do in planning your study. So if funders can't understand your plans and see that they make sense, they may not fund your study, or they will not fund your study. Briefly then, finances, the people you'll need to talk to, your local university, NHS, R&D finance officer. They will discuss with you research costs, and there'll be discussion if it's in a trust of excess treatment costs. Collaborators, finance officers, so are they happy with the costs and the sorting out of contracts? Now, of course, you personally may not have to do all this. You will have a research office who will hopefully help you do all this, but you will be informed of it, and you'll probably want to play a part in it one way or another. The research delivery network for cost attribution, NHS support costs and excess treatment costs. You need the time, building the time for that. Always consult your finance office at an early stage and be aware that costs are likely to be broken down by project year, not necessarily financial year. Be aware of timings for university or trust sign-off, especially at holiday times. The RDN SOCAT, it's going to take a while for sign-off. And just an alert to potential doctoral students out there, if you're applying to a university, there will be windows which you have to apply to get your PhD place, which is completely separate to your NIHR fellowship application, which will provide the finance for that PhD. So if you pitch up on September the 1st at Oxford University and say, look, I've got all this money to do a PhD, they'll say, well, you didn't apply and we haven't got a place for you. So be very aware of that. Be aware of which organisation is responsible for project sign-off. Be aware that a system will not necessarily exist for sorting out respective costs between collaborating organisations. I've been told by people who run finance that it can take years to set these things up sometimes. The participation or costs of other collaborators also need sign-off, and you will need formal collaboration agreements and contracts in place before funds can be distributed. Thinking of the overall budget, have you considered how the resources requested will be used? And they do usually ask in a research grant application for a justification of research costs. How realistic and accurate are these costs? Have you found the best price for tests? Is anything over budgeted? Are resources justified? Is there an efficient use of resources? And at the end of the day, is this good value for money? Because that is a criterion upon which the research grant application will be judged. So if funders cannot understand your costs or feel the study is not good value for money, they may not fund it. It's good to give yourself some leeway. I think probably nowadays you can't say 15% contingency costs, but you can build in a bit of wriggle room in your costs because things will pop up that you haven't considered that will have cost implications. Here are some useful links. So all the different organisations that I've mentioned, here are the web links for them if you want to explore a bit more about who they are and what they do.